Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Lawrence Pevsner, and I'm here to talk to you about Riskgaming. So we rehearse for almost everything that matters, right? Pilots train in flight simulators, surgeons practice on cadavers, athletes scrimmage before a game. But the hardest, most consequential skill of all goes largely unrehearsed. That is, making high-stakes decisions under pressure with incomplete information surrounding people who want different things. And yet, that's what happens every day inside our most important institutions. Our institutions don't decide by consensus. They decide through individuals. And those individuals, whether it's the head of an institution or some of the staff or people the institution is serving, they all have different incentives. And often those incentives are conflicting. They also often have different sources of information. Sometimes they have private agendas. And they're all acting simultaneously. It's a very complex system, and almost no one ever practices it. So should we be surprised that our institutions are failing us? It would be like expecting an untrained med student to be successful at brain surgery. Riskgaming is how we practice it. In these strategic simulations that we build, players take on a character and compete through a crisis drawn from the frontier of tech or business or geopolitics. The stakes are, of course, fictional. It's a made-up scenario. But if you get enough competitive people in a room, the insights become profound. When I tell people that my job is to design and host policy games on behalf of a venture capital firm in order to help people become more empathetic, I'm normally met with some incredulity. But it's true. Over the past 2 years, we've run dozens of Riskgaming scenarios where we've had senators and NATO officials, scientists, engineers, ministers, CEOs, journalists, and regulators all swap roles so they can understand each other's positions better. I sometimes describe it as D&D, but with policy issues. But it's actually a little bit more complicated than that. To explain how I got here and why we do this, I actually need to talk to you about my last job. That's me. Before I was a game designer, I was a speechwriter. I most recently led speechwriting for the US ambassador to the UN in the last administration, where my job was to write everything in the ambassador's voice. And her job, in addition to being a cabinet official, was to talk all the time. She's a diplomat. And so I had to write over 250 speeches a year. But I want to talk about the second speech I ever wrote for her. It was in March of 2021, and the UN General Assembly was meeting to discuss the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which is a major moment at the UN General Assembly. Normally, at these occasions, people give generic, supportive remarks about the importance of ending racism. That's often the job of a diplomat, to check the box and be diplomatic. But the ambassador and I wanted to do something different. As a black woman diplomat whose recent ancestors were enslaved, she wanted to talk about the racism she had personally experienced both at home and also abroad, why this was a shared challenge. So we wrote that speech. We told her story very directly. We named the racism she and so many others had experienced. And people were quite moved. Stoic diplomats came up to her in tears afterwards, and it earned us trust and credibility because we were willing to get personal and also to criticize ourselves. Afterwards, in fact, the Jamaican ambassador told CBS, that's one of the news stories up there, that diplomats aren't used to hearing personal stories in official settings. And Ambassador Thomas Greenfield gave a moving speech that was all the more powerful because it drew on our personal experience. I share this to say this is one of my big highlights as a speechwriter. This was what I was set out to do, to have this potent thing I knew how to do with words, which is make a room full of people who maybe came in even a little bit hostile, feel for a moment what it's like to be someone else. But I found over the course of my time there and over a decade of being a speechwriter that these speeches just had a ceiling I couldn't break through. Because ultimately, as the writer and as a speaker, I was having to do the empathizing and communicate the empathizing, and the audience only received it. A speech basically hands you a conclusion and says, what do you think? It doesn't actually build your own empathy muscle. And after 3 years at the State Department, I became disillusioned. I was feeling like as much as I would try to build strategic empathy into the speeches, I met with refugees from Afghanistan, protesters from Iran, defectors from North Korea, dissidents from Nicaragua, and assault survivors from South Sudan. And I featured their stories in our remarks over and over again. And I just kept seeing that it didn't actually change the votes in the room. It didn't seem to be doing anything different, and so I felt like I needed to do something different. And when I set out on that journey, I really, really, really did not expect to end up at a venture capital firm. Seems like the exact opposite, but I did, and I'm going to tell you why. So I work at Lux Capital, which is a firm that invests in science and technology. It specifically focuses on physical sciences, biological sciences, and computational sciences. I'm going to give you 3 examples of what I mean by that. So, for example, we invested in a company called eGenesis. This is a company that's genetically modifying pigs so that we can use their organs in humans. So, we have a huge organs crisis in this country and around the world where people are often waiting for a long time on wait lists and often don't get the organs that they need to survive. There are now, I believe, 5 people walking around in this country who have pig organs that are keeping them alive, specifically pig kidneys. And we're hoping to expand that significantly, and that's because we were able to genetically modify the pigs so that the organs weren't rejected by the human host. Second example, so that's biological sciences. Physical sciences, we have a company called Reflect Orbital. This is a company that's literally launching mirrors into space with the idea being to reflect sunlight back on Earth so that we can, for example, run solar farms at 24/7 rather than just half the time. We have a third company, that's physical sciences. On computational sciences, I have a company called Osmo. Osmo is a company that's digitizing smell. So the idea here is their computers can actually analyze all scents that we know about in the world. And so it's a better smeller than any human, and also dogs and other creatures as well. This has a lot of practical impacts, right? So for example, fentanyl is odorless, but only odorless to us. Everything emits an odor, and so now the computers at border crossings and things like that can detect fentanyl crossing. Or another example are diseases, some cancers, things like that, also emit an odor, so you can get much earlier detection through digitizing scent. So that's the kind of stuff that we're up to. But of course, when I say we're up to it, we don't build the technology, right? We're investing in it. We're evaluating hundreds of companies a year. And that means that we're generalists by necessity. No one at Lux is the world's leading expert on any technology. Instead, what we develop is pattern recognition, right? We are seeing what's coming, and we particularly are trying to predict what's going to come in the next 2 to 5 years before the rest of the conversation catches up. Because we have all these founders who are walking in our door and showing us what they're building in their nascent stages, and so we get to see the frontier in real time. That's the job. But that means that as my job, I'm part of the policy team. I'm supposed to try to prepare people for that future that we see coming. Take, for example, eGenesis, that first company I talked to you about with the pig kidneys. Eliminating the organ shortage, I think, is an unalloyed good. But there are complexities. For example, hospitals are right now largely funded by the money they make from organ transplants. So if this technology immediately arrived today before they were prepared, the bottom would fall out on the entire hospital system. So we need to have a conversation with them and try to persuade them that this might happen, and they need to think about ways to be able to handle that. Of course, that means talking to people who aren't always excited about what you have to share. That's why, and the other thing I should say is, of course, VCs, as a VC, we have our own incentive structure that I'm highly aware of because it's not neutral, right? We're professionally inclined to believe that the new thing is better than the old thing, and that the regulation is the friction getting in the way. And so Riskgaming, from my point of view, is our corrective to that. It's a corrective to our own ecosystem because it forces us to understand other people's perspectives. And it's also a corrective to helping people who don't understand and see the next technological frontier get their grips on it The whole point is to have people swap roles. So I joined in particular because their pitch to me was bring your storytelling and strategic empathy skills to science and policymaking directly. But why games in particular, right? Like you could say, well, just do advocacy in general, right? Do what everyone else does, which is, have a conference or a convening, write an op-ed, that kind of thing. There are lots of perfectly respectable ways people try to influence policy right now. But my argument is that the traditional version of policy engagement, say an op-ed, white paper, very few people are reading those anymore. They all treat problem as a policy of information transfer as well. If you just get the facts right in front of you, people, good policy will follow. But I think that's a beautiful theory that is ruined by contact with reality. You probably might have seen this Atlantic piece about how the end of reading is here with the cover story this month. And it's true for policy memos too. Look, I was writing these and taking these in myself when I was in government, and there just wasn't time to actually read through all the details. Maybe you could pull away 2 or 3 bullet points. The understanding just goes by like that. If we want to have people understand something new and different, we have to change the informational milieu they're operating in, and that's what risk gaming is all about. However, if you are still a reader, there are 2 books that have heavily influenced our thinking about risk gaming. One is Kelly Clancy, who's a neuroscientist. She worked at DeepMind. She wrote a book called Playing with Reality that makes the case better than I can. Her argument, which I think is relevant to everyone in this room, is that games have been used to model reality and improve decision-making for millennia. They predate written language, but the modern history is what matters for us. The traditional tools of policy analysis, say the cost-benefit analysis, the stakeholder mapping, regulatory impact assessment, they're descendants of an old tradition, but they share that limitation, which is they describe what rational actors should do, not what real people actually do. What we found through designing and running risk games is that the most important policy insights don't come from analysis, they come from experience, from putting people in a situation where they have to make a decision under uncertainty. That's what we do. So what are our principles? Well, first, every player has to act independently. There's no red team and there's no blue team. You're not assigned to argue a position. You're given a character with a bio, with a background and a story and your own private goals, asymmetric information, and constraints on your abilities. And then you are completely free to make your own choices. The outcomes emerge from dozens of these independent decisions interacting, which is, we believe, a much more faithful model of how policy actually works than anything designed from the top down. Second, the games are built on very deep research, right? Not just some kind of abstraction. So we spend weeks, months, sometimes years studying a domain before we design a game. We interview experts, we read the literature, we map the stakeholder landscape, and we try to use our competitive advantage, which is when we have access to people who really know this stuff. And then we try to compress all of that into a set of mechanics that captures the essential tensions of a real policy problem without reducing them to a cartoon. And then third and finally, the games have to be fun. There's a reason simulation teaches you something that a white paper can't, and it's that you're emotionally invested in the outcome. You care about winning. And because you care, you make decisions that reveal your real priorities, not your stated ones, not your analyzed ones, but the ones that emerge under pressure. There's a neuroscience reasons behind this too. This is in the Kelly Clancy book, and it's about dopamine. This is a chemical that everyone thinks is about pleasure. It's actually about prediction error. Your brain fires dopamine not when you get a reward, but when something happens that you didn't chimpanzee. I meant to say predict, but I just fired dopamine into all of your brains by saying an unexpected word, and so I bet you'll remember this point because it was surprising. Dopamine is about the pursuit of happiness rather than the happiness itself. The brain is a prediction machine, and dopamine is the error signal. And the research shows that the signal is strongest when the uncertainty is highest, when the odds are roughly 50-50. This means games which are structured around uncertainty and surprise are the neurological conditions under which the brain learns most effectively. Which brings me back to that old policy toolkit. The white paper has no prediction error. A risk game scenario is wall-to-wall prediction error. That's why people remember the game 6 months later. So that's what we've been doing. We've been bringing business leaders, scientists, politicians, all kinds of folks together to understand each other's perspectives. And we've done it around the world and across the country. We have two types of games, what we call full immersion games and salon experiences. The full immersion games are our deepest games where we really, really dig into the policy. They're about 6 to 10 people, 3 to 4 hours. Think of it as kind of like an executive retreat for these folks. And then we also have salon experiences, which we started building by popular demand. Those are about 10 to 50 people. We're planning one right now that could be potentially 200 people. They take about 1 to 2 hours, and you might have a cocktail in your hand while you play. We have covered a bunch of topics. A couple here, there's a hurricane aftermath, deep fakes and election security, biotech breakthroughs with uncertain side effects. But across all our games, we only have one goal. So these are some of our games. In action, that's Senator Mark Warner. One goal. We want to get a reaction like this. This is one of our players celebrating a win. Or one of our LPs who had a reaction like this. Because he had been screwed over in the game. Either one of those is going to fire that dopamine, which is what we're after. We have 7 published games, and we have 5 more that we've run plenty of, and we're just getting ready for publication as well. They are all open source, and they are all free to download at riskgaming.com. In the time remaining, I'm just going to fly through 1 or 2 games to try to get in a little depth, and maybe I'll take a question or two. So one of the games we have is called Gray Matter. This one's about selling science in the age of attention. The scenario here is 2027, and a postdoc at NYU accidentally creates a drug that purportedly enhances pattern recognition, right? It purports to make you smarter. 3 variants hit the market. The FDA has relaxed its process under an innovation acceleration framework. That's a real thing taken from the current administration, and nobody agrees on what the science says here. I designed this because I wanted a way to talk about things like AI and Ozempic and crypto and all these trends in technology and science where they have kind of hit influencer culture, hit the public mainstream before we have any idea like how they work and what they mean and what the science actually says about them. And the point here is, okay, in this game there are 3 currencies, information, attention, and money. And there are 3 types of players: information agents, scientists, researchers, scientists, researchers. There's attention agents, that's like everyone from Joe Rogan to Twitch streamers to science journalists. And then there's money agents, the people who are investing in the drugs. And the point is that all these folks have these different currencies, and they want to interact with one another, and they create an information market. So the scientists hold exclusive data, but they need attention to make it matter. The journalists can amplify whatever they want, but they need to get paid at the end of the day. And the investors, of course, they can get everything, but they have to choose between whether the information they get is credible or whether they want viral information instead. The insight really comes at the end of that game, where there's kind of an uncomfortable silence when I tell people what the science actually said at the bottom of the game, and the clues are kind of all there all along, and they realize how far the public record which gets published drifted from that truth. And the point is that narrative is not an input to the policy process, it is the policy process. Running low on time, so I'll just kind of fly through. We have another game called Dead Reckoning. This is about the European space economy. We ran this at Chatham House. Happy to talk more afterwards about what this was like. I have another game called Flagship Down. This is about the university crisis in this country. What happens when research gets slashed, when campus politics is divided, when AI is disrupting the classroom, and how do all of the different players at the university, everyone from the president to the board chair to the football coach to the head of the grad student union, how do these folks find a way to keep the university alive and when they have completely different ideas on what the university should be? And this week we have a game called Four Forks coming out. This is our first digital game that you can play. It kind of simulates the risk game experience in a small, compact way. And this is about possible different, even if the optimists are right about AI, well, that doesn't mean that actually things are going to go well. There's still a lot of politics to consider. What are those politics? How do the different people everyone from the president to a podcast host, how do they navigate that? I want to end there by just saying, look, every game that we publish is open source. all the guides, the roles, the scoring, the facilitator instructions. The point is we want you to actually dig into it and see the choices that we made and why we made those choices. So I hope you play them. I hope you adapt them to your own uses, steal the method. It's all on riskgaming.com. Ultimately, our goal is to offer up civic infrastructure, to force people to swap roles, to walk in each other's shoes and have fun doing it. And because, taking a walk in someone else's shoes is normally meant figuratively, imaginatively, but there's no substitute for actually slipping those shoes on and going for a stroll. Thank you.